Over the last few weeks, I've been reflecting on the idea of expanded intelligence. I originally saw the phrase on a Substack post, and it has stuck with me. I'm beginning to think it may be a better way to think about artificial intelligence. Rather than seeing AI as something outside of us, perhaps it is better understood as something that expands our own intelligence. I've continued to turn that idea over in my mind because the more I think about it, the more I realize it isn't really a statement about technology. It is a different frame through which to understand what this moment might actually represent. That word, frame, has become increasingly interesting to me. Whether we realize it or not, every major topic in society is viewed through one. Politics, climate, education, healthcare, money, artificial intelligence. Before we ever form an opinion, someone has already decided which parts of the issue deserve our attention and which remain outside the picture. Sometimes framing is done by the media, sometimes by our societal culture, sometimes by our profession, sometimes simply by the language we inherit. We rarely notice the frame itself because once we've lived inside it long enough, it simply begins to feel like reality. But before we go any further, let me take a minute to introduce myself if you are new here. My name is Chris Schmelzer, and I serve leaders who recognize the need and understand that the old models of leading and working are no longer keeping up with the pace of change. Every week, I track the subtle signals that a massive reset is coming for what we refer to as white-collar work, and share thoughts on how to lead yourself and your organization through the age of accelerating change. If you find any value in this video, like it, share your comments below, and subscribe. There is a concept in political science known as the Overton window that describes this remarkably well. The Overton window is the range of ideas that society considers acceptable at a given moment in time. Imagine looking through a window. Everything inside the frame of that window represents what culture has come to view as reasonable. Everything outside the frame feels unrealistic, extreme, or perhaps even dangerous. The interesting part isn't what's inside the window. It's that the window itself actually moves. The Overton window reminds us that what feels reasonable is often far more fluid than we'd like to believe. What seems unimaginable in one generation can become completely ordinary in the next. The evolution of recreational marijuana is probably one of the clearest examples in recent memory. Only a couple of decades ago, the idea of legal recreational marijuana felt politically impossible in much of the United States. The conversation then shifted toward decriminalization. From there, the conversation expanded into medical use in many states. Eventually, recreational use followed. Regardless of where someone stands on the issue, it's difficult to argue that the cultural frame has changed dramatically in a relatively short period of time. The same pattern has played out throughout history. Women's suffrage, smoking in restaurants, working remotely, even the language surrounding climate has evolved from global warming to climate change to what many now refer to as the climate crisis. Each represents more than a change in terminology. It reflects a gradual movement in what society has come to consider reasonable. The Overton window rarely moves overnight. One of the ways it moves is through repeated exposure. Psychologist Robert Zayonk described something known as the mere exposure effect. His research showed that the more we're exposed to an idea, a symbol, or even a face, the more familiar it becomes. The more familiar something becomes, the less foreign it can begin to feel. What I find most interesting about the research is that increased familiarity does not make something more correct. It simply means it feels more acceptable. This is important because as I reflect on it, I recognize that familiarity and truth are not the same thing. However, we often mistake one for the other. It also made me wonder whether organizations have their own Overton windows. I remember working with several organizations in 2023. Only 3 years ago, the idea of using generative AI to draft presentations, summarize meetings, or analyze strategy sounded reckless to many of them. Today, many of those same organizations are investing millions, trying to encourage employees to use the technology. The window moved. Every transformation begins with an idea that, at least initially, sits outside the organization's current window of what feels reasonable. A new operating model, a different organizational structure, a change in strategy with customers, artificial intelligence becoming part of everyday work. None of these ideas become accepted because a leader announces them. They become accepted because, over time, the organization slowly begins to see them through a different frame. For most of history, our frames were largely inherited. We absorbed them from our families, our education, our professions, the books we read, the media we consumed, and the organizations where we worked. Challenging those frames wasn't impossible, but it required considerable effort. If you wanted to understand a topic from multiple perspectives, you often had to seek out multiple books, various experts, and often many years of study. Artificial intelligence changes that equation significantly. For the first time, many of us have almost effortless access to competing frames. Try this yourself. Ask ChatGPT, Claude, or whatever large language model you use to explain the same issue through the lens of a psychologist, an economist, a historian, a systems thinker, and someone who fundamentally disagrees with all of them. In less than 2 minutes, you have 5 legitimate ways of seeing the same problem. I've started thinking about this as frame abundance. I can't think of another point in history where ordinary people have had this kind of access to competing or complementary frames. At first glance, that feels like an incredible gift. And ultimately, I believe it actually is. But the more I sit with it, the more I wonder if it also creates a new challenge. When perspectives become abundant, discernment becomes even more scarce. Having access to more frames doesn't necessarily make decisions easier. In many cases, it makes them more difficult, because it becomes easier to get lost exploring perspectives than it is to decide what is true or what deserves action. Which brings me back to the idea I've been wrestling with over the last few weeks. Expanded intelligence. Maybe expanded intelligence isn't simply the ability to generate more answers through AI, but instead, I'm beginning to think expanded intelligence is the capacity to recognize the frame you're already standing inside, intentionally explore other plausible frames, and then decide what deserves your belief or attention. I wonder if this is what AI is actually expanding. But if that's true, it raises another question. What actually allows us to recognize the frame we're already standing inside? Awareness. And the more I study leadership, organizational transformation, and change, the more convinced I become that awareness isn't merely thinking. We've been taught to believe awareness is purely cognitive, that if we simply think harder, we'll see more clearly. Over the last several years, I've become convinced that awareness is as physiological as it is cognitive. That conviction has come not only through my own practices in breathwork, meditation, and yoga, but also through the neuroscience I've spent years studying. Increasingly, that research suggests our brains are not passive observers of reality. Our physiology is constantly shaping how we interpret the world long before we're consciously aware of it. When our nervous system is activated, our perspective narrows. We become more attached to certainty and less open to exploration. We hold tightly to the frame we've inherited because what is familiar often feels safer than what is unknown. As I was writing this, I realized something I hadn't connected before. The Overton window moves, in part, through repeated exposure. Repeated exposure creates familiarity. Familiarity can reduce our sense of threat. And our nervous system is constantly scanning for safety. This might be why frames become so powerful. They don't simply shape what we think, but they shape what ultimately feels safe to believe. Because our nervous system is constantly scanning for safety, a regulated nervous system becomes even more important. When our nervous system is regulated, when we remain present and flexible, rather than consumed by threat, something different becomes available. We become capable of noticing the frame itself. From there, we are able to ask better questions. We can become curious instead of defensive. For the last couple years, I've argued that the future belongs to leaders who ask better questions. I'm beginning to wonder if that's incomplete. I am beginning to sense that the future belongs to leaders who first recognize the frame from which they are asking those questions. Maybe that's one of the quiet opportunities AI presents us. Not simply that it gives us more information at the ease of a prompt, but that it gives us the ability to explore more frames than ever before. Artificial intelligence may become remarkably good at generating perspectives, but it cannot decide which perspective deserves your attention. That remains deeply human work. Perhaps expanded intelligence is simply this: expanding our capacity to see before we decide. If you want to explore how to lead yourself and your organization through the age of accelerating change, my new book, The Missing Link, offers a new lens. It shows why most change efforts stall and how human capacity, not just strategy, determines success. Once you see it, you'll lead change very differently. You can access it for free right now. Link is below the video.